In a quiet southern town, just after midnight, a black woman drives home in a government-issued SUV. Her peace is shattered when a local police officer appears behind her, claiming she was drifting out of her lane, pulling her over, and handing her a ticket, simply because she is black. What he doesn't realize is that the woman he's trying to intimidate is a lieutenant colonel with decades of battlefield discipline and zero tolerance for abuse of power. And this time, she won't just hold him accountable, she'll force an entire police department to reevaluate everything they thought they could get away with. Before we dive back in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something powerful coming your way that you won't want to miss. The streets of Charleston, South Carolina were quiet that night, eerily quiet. It was 11:23 p.m. on a Wednesday. The kind of hour when most people had already drifted into sleep and the city's heartbeat slowed to a hush. The sodium yellow streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and an occasional breeze stirred loose leaves across the asphalt. The only movement came from distant headlights sweeping occasionally around corners like silent ghosts. One of those sets of headlights belonged to a black government-issued SUV rolling steadily through the city. Behind the wheel was Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter. She wasn't thinking about danger. Her mind, sharp as ever, was already drifting toward the comforts of home, a warm shower, her soft bed, the sound of silence after a long day. She had just driven nearly 2 hours north from a logistics meeting at Fort Ivory, her role as the commanding officer of operations at Fort Waverly, leaving her little time for rest. She was used to it. 21 years of service in the Army had trained her to function under pressure, to lead in chaos, to endure without complaint. She'd done tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, organized disaster relief operations in Louisiana, and coordinated troop deployments in some of the most volatile zones on Earth. But tonight she wasn't a war veteran. She wasn't a Bronze Star recipient. She was just a woman trying to get home. Naomi was tall, with strong shoulders and a graceful confidence in every movement. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a strand out of place. Her dark eyes stayed focused on the road ahead, scanning the area out of habit rather than concern. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't swerving. Her SUV, while standard issue, was clean and silent, moving like a shadow among shadows. She hummed softly to herself, the low rumble of the tires on the pavement, her only accompaniment. Everything about her demeanor said calm, controlled, uneventful, but not everyone sees the same thing through the windshield. Parked just beyond a bend near Middleton Avenue sat Sergeant Rick Mallory. Mallory was in his cruiser, sipping from a coffee cup gone cold over an hour ago, the lid still half-bitten from habit. He had one elbow propped up on the door, scrolling through his phone with the casual boredom of someone whose night had refused to offer any real excitement. His shift had been dead, not even a bar fight to break the monotony. He glanced up and saw the SUV glide past. Dark windows, government plates, out of place at this hour. His eyes narrowed. Mallory was 46. A Charleston police officer for 15 years, built like a man who used to play linebacker in college and never stopped seeing himself that way. He had a square jaw, grizzled stubble, and a gaze that made rookies stand straighter when he entered the locker room. He liked order. He liked compliance. And most of all, he liked when people didn't ask too many questions. He muttered under his breath, tossed his coffee out the window, and flipped on his lights. Naomi saw the red and blue flash before she heard the siren. She glanced at her rearview mirror inside, not from guilt or fear, but from weariness. Still, she guided the SUV gently to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, the way every black parent teaches their children to do, even when they've done nothing wrong. The patrol car door slammed shut. She watched in the mirror as the figure approached, tall, heavy-set. Flashlight already raised hand, resting casually, no intentionally on his holstered weapon. He didn't bother walking to the passenger side for safety. He came straight to her window. Aggressive. Intentional. Naomi rolled the window down halfway and spoke before he could. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" His voice was clipped, sharp. "License and registration." She didn't move. "With respect, officer, I'd like to know the reason for the stop. You were drifting between lanes. Didn't signal. Might have been drinking." "I haven't been drinking," she said calmly. "License. Registration." His tone climbed a notch. Naomi remained composed. She reached slowly into the glove box, pulled out her documents, and handed them over. "This is a government vehicle. I'm a federal employee. Mallory smirked without looking at the ID. Military, yes. He looked at her finally. Not seeing her, measuring her, doesn't mean you're above the law. I never said I was. There was a long pause and electric silence between them. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her heart was steady. Mallory didn't like it. Step out of the vehicle. Her eyes narrowed. Excuse me, I said step out of the car. I'm conducting a sobriety test. Naomi breathed in once deeply. Her pulse rose slightly, but her tone stayed even. Officer, I've cooperated. I haven't been drinking. On what grounds are you demanding a field test? He stepped closer. His frame loomed in her side view. Are you refusing a lawful order? I'm asking for an explanation. He didn't give one. Instead, he reached for the door handle. Naomi saw the motion and, without raising her voice, reached down to her console and pressed a button. Record. Just so we're clear, she said as the phone camera activated, this conversation is being recorded. His eyes flicked to the phone. Something behind his bravado shifted, just a flicker of doubt, but he masked it quickly. Out. Now. She stepped out, standing tall, her boots hitting the pavement with quiet finality. She didn't raise her voice, didn't posture, but the air around her shifted. Her presence was undeniable even in plain clothes. There was a weight to her stillness. Mallory had expected submission. What he got was control. He had her walk a line under the street lamp, recite the alphabet backward, follow his finger with her eyes. Every test was performed flawlessly. She didn't stumble, didn't argue, didn't crack. And still he handed her a ticket, failure to maintain lane. Naomi took it, folded it once, slipped it into her jacket pocket. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes said everything. She got back in the car and drove off. Behind her, Mallory stood stiff in the cold, watching her taillights fade. He didn't know it yet, but that ticket, that stop that night would follow him further than he could imagine. To a bystander, this would have seemed like just another traffic stop. No arrest, no violence, no shouting. But for Naomi and for anyone who has ever felt their dignity challenged simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong color skin, it was yet another reminder of how easily power can be abused. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't escalate, because she knew that too often, emotion from someone like her is interpreted as threat. She carried that weight with practiced grace. But the insult landed. It always did. The truth is, no matter how many medals you earn, no matter how long you serve, or how perfectly you obey, there are still those who will see you only through the lens of what they expect to see. And what Rick Mallory saw wasn't a lieutenant colonel. He saw a black woman alone at night, and that for him was enough. For Naomi, it was the beginning, because some battles aren't fought overseas. Some are fought in silence on quiet streets under blinking lights and against the kind of enemy you can't always see the presumption of guilt, the hunger for control, the unchecked comfort of authority. And Naomi Carter had seen enemies before. She knew how to fight. The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the Charleston Police Department flickered weakly as Officer Jamie Whitaker stepped into the station, the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant lingering in the air. He nodded politely at the front desk clerk, clocked in, and made his way to the locker room, the sound of his boots echoing softly on the linoleum floor. The locker room wasn't loud, but there was a kind of tension that always buzzed under the surface. You felt it more than you heard it. Jamie didn't speak much. That wasn't his way. At 33, Jamie was one of the younger officers on the force, though not the newest. He'd been wearing the badge for just over 2 years, long enough to know the rules, but still new enough to question them. He was Vietnamese-American, tall and lean, with a quiet energy that people often mistook for passivity. But Jamie watched, Jamie listened, and Jamie remembered things others were too busy or too arrogant to notice. Sergeant Rick Mallory was already there, leaning back on a bench with his feet crossed, tossing a granola bar wrapper into the trash can and laughing to himself. Jamie offered a polite nod, starting to turn toward his locker, but Mallory called out, "Hey, Whitaker," he said, dragging out the name like it tasted strange in his mouth. "You should have seen this lady I pulled over last night. Some middle-aged black woman driving a Fed SUV like she's in a parade. Claimed she was some big shot in the military. Had the whole speech ready. 'I'm a lieutenant colonel,' she said." Can you believe that Jamie paused, his fingers resting on the combination lock? "What was the reason for the stop?" he asked, careful not to sound confrontational. Mallory shrugged. "I gave her a line about drifting lanes. She wasn't doing much, really. But hey, you know how it is." Looked suspicious. Didn't like my tone, started recording on her phone like she's some activist. Real power trip, man. Jamie didn't laugh. Something in his gut twisted. Not anger, but discomfort. There was a rule they had drilled into him at the academy. Don't ignore the feeling that something isn't right. ****. And something about this wasn't right. Did she say her name? Jamie asked, now turning to face him. Yeah. Carter. Naomi Carter. Ring any bells? Mallory grinned like he was waiting for a punchline. Jamie didn't answer. But the name did **** ring a bell. He remembered sitting in a mandatory civil rights seminar the year before. It was hot that day and most officers were fidgeting with their pens or sneaking looks at their phones. But Jamie had paid attention. The guest speaker had been a decorated Army officer, tall, composed with a voice that carried without needing to raise. Her name was ***, Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter. And what she said stuck. She'd talked about restraint, about how leadership wasn't about commanding louder, but about listening harder. She told a room full of law enforcement professionals that the real test of power came when you had every reason to act and chose not to. He remembered that. He remembered her. Back in the locker room, Mallory was still ranting. She tried to flash her ID like it was supposed to scare me. I gave her the full test. Straight line alphabet the works. She passed, sure, but I still wrote her up. Can't let them feel like they're untouchable. Jamie didn't respond. He finished opening his locker, pulled out his tablet, and sat down at the edge of the bench. As Mallory's voice faded into background noise, Jamie typed Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter into a browser. The search loaded instantly. Articles, profiles, a Department of Defense recognition piece, Bronze Star for Logistics Command under fire, keynote speaker at the National Defense Leadership Summit, advocate for racial equity within the armed forces. This woman wasn't just military. She was a leader, a veteran, a name. And Sergeant Mallory had written her a ticket for drifting lanes at night and laughed about it like she was some civilian trying to skip a parking fine. Jamie stared at the screen, his thoughts beginning to spiral. If that had gone differently, if she hadn't stayed calm, what would have happened? The idea that the outcome might have depended entirely on Naomi's self-control rather than the officer's professionalism chilled him. He thought of his own mother, his sister, his community. How many times had they told him, be extra careful, keep your hands visible, don't make sudden moves? He'd lived with that warning since middle school, not because he was guilty, but because he couldn't afford to be misunderstood. He wondered if Naomi Carter felt the same. Mallory got up and stretched, groaning. Anyway, he said, patting Jamie on the back, she'll forget about it. They always do. You just gotta hold your ground, rookie. Jamie forced a small smile, then nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was restraint. As Mallory walked off, the sound of his heavy steps echoing through the corridor, Jamie sat still, hands on his lap. The screen of his tablet dimmed slightly, casting a softer light across his face. A thought pushed its way to the front of his mind, stubborn and sharp. What happens when someone like her doesn't forget? Because the truth was, Jamie wasn't new enough to be naive anymore. He knew the stories that never got told. The quiet apologies swept under reports. The people who didn't have cameras or didn't hit record in time. The people who backed down just to go home safe. And the ones who didn't. Most of his fellow officers believed that the badge automatically made them the authority, the voice, the final word. But Jamie had started to realize that the real authority came from understanding the limits of your power, not abusing them. He stood up, locked his tablet, and looked at the hallway where Mallory had disappeared. There was a sinking feeling in his chest that wouldn't go away. Not because of guilt Jamie hadn't done anything, but because now he knew. He knew that someone like Naomi Carter could make this more than a traffic stop. She had the training, the patience, the credibility. She wasn't the kind of person who yelled into a phone camera for attention. She was the kind who let the facts speak clearly, precisely, and at the right time. And if she chose to speak, Jamie had no doubt people would listen. That thought made him nervous. Not for himself, but for the system around him. For the first time since joining the force, Jamie questioned where his silence might place him. Was neutrality still neutral? If it protected the wrong person, could he keep going about his day knowing what Mallory had done, laughing it off in the locker room like just another story? He didn't know yet what Naomi would do, but he knew what she could do, and that was enough to set the first quiet ripple through his conscience. He returned to his locker, pulled out his body camera unit, and clipped it on his vest, eyes flickering briefly to the blinking blue light. Some people wear badges to feel powerful. Some wear them because they believe in protecting others. And then there are those caught in between figuring out which kind of cop they want to be. Jamie Whitaker had a choice to make, and whether he liked it or not, the clock had already started. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter's office, casting narrow golden lines across her desk, highlighting the organized chaos of folders, briefing binders, and a half-empty coffee mug she hadn't touched since the night before. She sat in her chair, her back straight, but not stiff, one elbow resting gently on the armrest, her eyes locked on the phone placed before her screen, paused at a video frame of her own face caught in the soft glow of headlights and the harsh beam of a flashlight. It was quiet in the room, save for the low hum of the base's HVAC system and the distant rhythm of boots on polished tile floors outside her door. Naomi hadn't slept well. Not because she was afraid, but because her mind had replayed the stop-on loop, every word, every movement, every calculated silence from the man who had presumed she was less than she is. Not once had she raised her voice. Not once had she argued. But the weight of that restraint stayed with her heavier than any gear she'd worn in deployment. A knock tapped once, then twice on the door. Ma'am Sergeant Charlotte James peaked in her voice, measured but concerned. Naomi looked up. "Come in, Sergeant." Charlotte stepped inside briskly. 29, sharp-minded and efficient Charlotte was known across Fort Waverly as Naomi's right hand. She was dark-skinned, her tight curls pinned up, uniform crisp, and voice always calm under pressure. She was the kind of soldier who read policy manuals in her free time and annotated them. More importantly, she was one of the few Naomi trusted enough to speak freely with. Charlotte shut the door behind her and crossed the room. "I saw the footage." Naomi nodded once. "I sent it to legal." Charlotte hesitated, then sat. Eleanor Naomi exhaled through her nose. "Yes, I sent it this morning." No emotion, no claims, just the facts. Charlotte watched her closely. "Are you sure you want to file formal complaint?" Naomi's eyes didn't waver. "I'm not looking for retribution. I'm looking for record." Silence held for a moment between them, not uncomfortable but dense with understanding. Charlotte finally said, "It's just, people will talk. The department, the media, if this gets out. You know how this works, ma'am. They'll try to flip the story." Naomi turned her gaze back to the screen, tapping it once to pause at the exact moment Sergeant Mallory ordered her out of the vehicle with a hand hovering too close to his weapon. "That's why I kept calm. That's why I documented it. Because if I lose my temper, I'm the problem. And if I say nothing, it never happened." Charlotte lowered her gaze. She knew Naomi was right. Black women in uniform were expected to carry more weight, speak more carefully, and endure more scrutiny than anyone else in the room. The line was thinner, the margin of error smaller, and the cost of being difficult was often career-ending. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her tone low but unwavering. "This isn't just about me. It never was. It's about every soldier I've mentored, every private who thinks staying silent will keep them safe, every woman who's ever had to pretend she wasn't humiliated just to avoid escalation. If I don't say something, what example do I leave?" Charlotte nodded slowly. "Then I've got your back." Naomi gave a small nod in return. "Thank you, Sergeant. That's all for now." After Charlotte left, Naomi stood and walked to the window, arms crossed loosely over her chest. The base was alive with its usual morning rhythm cadets, moving in formation trucks, passing through the gate, an aircraft humming overhead. To anyone watching, it was just another day. But for Naomi, the next few hours would define a different kind of mission. At 11:40 a.m., she walked into the base legal office, a modest two-room building off the admin wing. Inside, stacks of reference binders lined the walls, and behind one desk sat Eleanor Tay, the post's senior military legal advisor. Eleanor was a woman who had seen too much and shown too little. At 48, she wore her experience like a second uniform, precise, unwavering, and built for war zones of a different kind. She looked up as Naomi entered and stood halfway extending a hand. "Colonel Carter." "I received the video," she said, her voice as neutral as a court transcript. Naomi shook her hand and sat across from her. "Then you know why I'm here." Eleanor opened a manila folder already containing a printed transcript, several screenshots from the video, and Naomi's written report. "You've documented everything thoroughly. No embellishments, no opinions, just the facts." "I was deliberate," Naomi said. "I didn't want it questioned." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "You're aware this can get messy." Naomi didn't blink. I've led convoys under fire. I can handle messy." Eleanor gave the faintest smile, then straightened. "Then let's talk next steps. I'll forward the complaint to the Inspector General for review. Since the stop occurred off base, the civilian department will handle the disciplinary portion, but your recording provides a direct view of the encounter. Combined with the body cam footage, there's no room for interpretation. This wasn't routine. This was targeted." Naomi nodded, her expression unreadable. "I don't need him punished. I need the system questioned." "Understood." For the next hour, they reviewed every second of the recording, cross-referencing it with departmental policies, civilian rights, and federal use of force guidelines. Eleanor took notes, flagged key timestamps, and drafted a formal request for civilian oversight. Naomi didn't flinch once, because for her, this wasn't about a grudge. It was about precedent. There was a quiet, often ignored strength in choosing process over protest. It didn't make headlines. It didn't trend online. But it lasted, because while emotions fade, paperwork stays. Paperwork goes on file. Paperwork is reviewed. Paperwork gets read by people in rooms that make policy. Naomi had learned long ago that emotion could be dismissed, but documentation was harder to erase. As they wrapped up, Eleanor handed her a printed summary. "We'll log the formal complaint today. Once it's submitted, you'll likely hear from the city attorney's office. They may try to settle. You'll have a choice." Naomi took the folder. "I've already made it." Eleanor paused, considering her. "You're not doing this for yourself, are you?" Naomi shook her head. "I'm doing this for everyone who never got the chance." When Naomi returned to her office that afternoon, she closed the door behind her and sat in silence. Her inbox pinged with new messages. Her phone buzzed with meeting reminders. Life moved on, as it always did. But beneath the surface, a shift had occurred. Not in volume, not in tone, but in direction. Because now there was a record, there was a complaint, there was evidence, and most importantly, there was intention. For many, it would have been easier to let it go, to justify it as a misunderstanding, to write it off as a bad night and move forward. That was the path of least resistance, the safe path. But Naomi Carter didn't choose silence over justice, and that choice, quiet, professional, methodical, was the most powerful one she could make. Because in a world where people still assume rank doesn't matter, if your skin is too dark, or your voice too calm, or your gender too inconvenient, her decision to act by the book was a declaration. You don't have to shout to make noise. You don't have to burn bridges to create change. And you don't have to be loud to be heard. Some revolutions begin with marching in the streets. Others begin with a signature on a page. Naomi had just written hers. The envelope was plain, no markings beyond his name, typed neatly across the front in block letters. It sat on Sergeant Rick Mallory's desk like a dare, daring him to care. He'd found it when he returned from patrol just after noon, tossed among a few inter-office memos and a stale, half-eaten energy bar he'd forgotten about. At first, he didn't pay attention. Probably some updated department policy, another mandatory training schedule, maybe something from internal affairs about body cam maintenance. But when he finally tore it open with one hand and glanced at the first page, something shifted. It wasn't a memo. It was a court summons. His name, printed in bold, sat beneath the words, "Civil Rights Complaint. Notice of Hearing. Plaintiff Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter," the same woman he'd pulled over just days ago, the one who kept her voice calm while he raised his, the one who recorded the entire encounter on her phone. The one who, according to Officer Whitaker's whispers yesterday, might be more than just a lady with an attitude. Mallory stood there in the narrow space between his desk and the wall, staring at the paper. Then he laughed. It wasn't the confident kind of laugh. It was short, brittle, and forced. "No way," he muttered to no one. "No way this sticks." But deep down, something cracked. 10 minutes later, a voice buzzed over the radio from the front desk. "Sergeant Mallory, Captain Abrams wants to see you. Now." He crumpled the envelope into his pocket, grabbed his badge off the table, and walked down the hall. The precinct wasn't especially large, but the path to the captain's office felt longer than usual. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed too bright. The footsteps of other officers, ones who nodded a little too curtly or looked away too quickly, felt louder than usual. When he reached the door labeled Captain Eli Abrams, he knocked once. "Come in." Mallory entered. The office was neat but worn. The furniture was sturdy, the walls bare except for a faded American flag and a photo of Abrams in uniform from 15 years ago. The captain sat behind a desk that had seen better days, his hands folded across a manila folder that looked eerily similar to the one Mallory had just opened. "Close the door," Abrams said, his voice low but steady. Mallory did. He stayed standing. Abrams didn't speak right away. He watched Mallory for a moment, reading him like he had 100 times before. Then he opened the folder slowly. "We need to talk." Mallory crossed his arms. "I already saw it. Some woman's trying to make this a federal case because I pulled her over, and she didn't like it. That woman," Abrams said, his tone sharpening, "is Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter. High-ranking, 2 deployments, Bronze Star. She runs operations at Fort Waverly. And she didn't just complain. She filed formal charges with video evidence." Mallory shrugged. "Doesn't matter who she is. I was doing my job." Abrams leaned back in his chair. "Were you? Because from what I've seen, what you were doing was escalating a situation that didn't require escalation. You made a decision in the dark without probable cause, then tried to flex authority when she didn't cower. She didn't obey," Mallory said flatly. "She didn't resist either," Abrams replied. "There's a difference, Rick." Mallory's jaw tightened. "So we just back down now. Every time someone questions us, we let people flash their IDs and walk away. Because they have rank." Abrams stood now, slowly, deliberately. He was taller than Mallory remembered, or maybe it was just the shift in tone. "No, but we follow the law. We follow department protocol. And we don't treat people like suspects just because they don't jump fast enough when we speak." "I am the law out there," Mallory snapped. "No," Abrams said, sharply voiced, like a hammer on steel. "You're a man carrying a badge. You enforce the law. You don't get to define it on your own terms. And this time, you crossed the line." For a long moment, the room was silent. Mallory stared at the edge of the desk, hands now tucked into his belt, trying to swallow the frustration clawing up his throat. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like being questioned. And he especially didn't like the idea that one interaction, one stop, could put his entire career under a microscope. He'd survived 15 years on this force, seen things most rookies couldn't handle, dealt with drunks, dealers, and desperate people at 3 a.m., and now suddenly he was the one under scrutiny because someone didn't like his tone. "This is ridiculous," he said under his breath. "No," Abrams said, again firmer. "What's ridiculous is thinking you can treat a decorated officer like a threat with no cause and then walk away like it's business as usual. You think this department needs more lawsuits? More bad press. We've spent the last 3 years rebuilding trust in this community after the last mess we inherited. And now, thanks to you, we're about to be the next headline." Mallory didn't respond. He looked down at the summons now crumpled in his pocket and felt the weight of every camera, every bystander, every policy manual he'd ignored because he thought he knew better. "You're being placed under internal review," Abrams said, "effective immediately." "What does that mean?" Mallory asked, voice low. "It means you're off the street. Desk duty until the hearing. No patrol. No stops. No contact with civilians without direct supervision." Mallory's shoulders tensed. "You're serious? I'm saving your career," Abrams said, voice lowering now. "Because if this goes the way it's heading, and the footage makes it hard to argue, otherwise you're going to need everything you've got left." There was nothing left to say. Mallory left the office, footsteps heavier than when he'd entered. As he walked back to his desk, officers he'd worked beside for years nodded less enthusiastically. 1 or 2 avoided eye contact altogether, and in the air there was something unspoken but undeniable. He wasn't untouchable anymore. Because power feels permanent until it's not, and respect feels earned until it's questioned. Back at his desk, Mallory dropped into his chair, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling for a moment. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above him. The summons still rested in his pocket. And for the first time in a long while, Rick Mallory felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Not guilt, not regret, but fear. Because when you've spent years believing you can't be held accountable the moment accountability knocks, it doesn't tap gently. It kicks the damn door in. And suddenly, every action, every word, every order barked in the dark to someone who looked too confident, too calm, or too aware starts to echo. He looked around the room, and for the first time he noticed the silence wasn't peace. It was distance. People didn't challenge him, but now they didn't stand beside him either. It was a kind of exile, the quiet kind. And that's when it hit him. When the shield stops being protection and becomes a mirror, you don't always like what's staring back. The courthouse in downtown Charleston stood like a stone monument beneath a cloudy morning sky, its columns weathered by time, its steps worn by the weight of justice and delay. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of pew-like benches, and the air was thick with that specific tension, Only courtrooms know where silence carries more weight than words and where every glance feels like testimony. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter entered through the side hallway reserved for witnesses and legal personnel, her presence turning heads before she even stepped fully into view. She wore her full-service dress uniform dark navy blue jacket, lined with her ribbons, the bronze star resting above her heart, golden pins marking her rank shining against her collar. Her hair was pinned back in its standard bun regulation tight, and her expression was composed, unmoved, unflinching, unreadable. She didn't walk quickly. She didn't make eye contact with anyone unnecessarily. She simply moved forward, each step measured as if she were stepping into a mission briefing room rather than a civil courtroom. People noticed, not because she demanded attention, but because presence doesn't need permission to be felt. At the plaintiff's table sat her legal counsel, Eleanor Tay, dressed sharply in a navy blue suit and minimal jewelry. Eleanor nodded once as Naomi approached her face, betraying a quiet kind of respect. Behind them, a handful of uniformed personnel from Fort Waverly had come in quiet support. No cheers, no slogans, just silent unity seated among civilians and courtroom observers. Across the aisle at the defense table sat Sergeant Rick Mallory. Gone was the cocky grin. Gone was the relaxed posture of the locker room braggart. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked a size too tight at the collar, his tie slightly crooked despite his attempts to fix it twice already. His attorney, a lean, sharp-featured man named Charles Brenner, whispered something close to his ear. Mallory nodded stiffly, but he didn't look up. The judge, a stern but even-keeled woman named Honorable Judith Alvarez, entered at 9:06. The room stood, then everyone sat. The case was announced. The formal title echoed through the chambers like a slow wave. Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter versus Sergeant Rick Mallory, Charleston Police Department. Civil rights complaint, unlawful detainment, and abuse of authority. Plaintiff's counsel may proceed, Judge Alvarez said. Eleanor rose. We call Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter to the stand. The room didn't stir, but there was something in the air, like everyone collectively stopped breathing. Naomi stood, walked to the witness box, and took her oath with a voice that was steady and low. Then she sat adjusting her posture only once. The uniform seemed more than ceremonial. It wasn't armor, it was evidence. Not of her value, but of the contrast between how she lived and how she had been treated. Lieutenant Colonel Carter Eleanor began. Can you describe the events of the evening of March 17th? Yes, Naomi said. I was returning from Fort Ivory to Fort Waverly. It was approximately 11:20 p.m. I was driving a government-issued vehicle within speed limits on Route 17 near Middleton Avenue. I was stopped by a Charleston police cruiser with no prior warning. I was not swerving. I was not impaired. I had not committed any traffic violation. Her voice was neither emotional nor robotic. It was measured factual, like delivering a debrief. Eleanor nodded. And how did the officer approach? He came directly to the driver's side. He did not provide a greeting. He requested my license and registration. When I asked for the reason of the stop, he claimed I was drifting between lanes and might be under the influence. Were you under the influence? No. Did you comply with his requests? Yes. I handed over my documents, informed him I was a federal employee operating a government vehicle, and stated my role. And then he ordered me out of the car without further explanation. I asked why. He repeated the order. That is when I began recording the encounter on my personal phone. Eleanor paused. You didn't raise your voice, no. You didn't resist, no. Eleanor glanced at the jury. And why did you begin recording? Naomi looked directly ahead. Because I've been trained to know when something is no longer about safety and has become about control. I recorded for transparency, for my protection. The courtroom was silent. Eleanor turned to the judge. With permission, we'd like to play the phone recording and body camera footage side by side. Granted, Judge Alvarez said. The lights dimmed slightly. A screen lowered behind the witness box. The footage began. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The tone of Mallory's voice sharp and dismissive. The absence of justification. Naomi's calm replies. Her steady hands on the wheel. The moment he opened the door without warning. The moment she said, "This is being recorded." The silence that followed. Even from the defense table, Mallory didn't move. When the footage ended, there was no applause, no gasp, just the heavy weight of clarity. Eleanor turned back to Naomi. How did this make you feel? Naomi didn't pause. It made me feel invisible, not as a soldier, as a citizen. Do you believe the stop would have ended differently if you were someone else? I believe he saw a black woman in a dark vehicle at night and assumed no consequences. Eleanor nodded once, then turned to the judge. No further questions. Brenner rose. Lieutenant Colonel Carter, he said, his voice smooth but pressing, isn't it true that officers are trained to act cautiously during late-night stops? Yes, and that some civilians, even if innocent, can behave in ways that increase suspicion, correct. Brenner walked slowly. So when Sergeant Mallory said you were drifting, isn't it possible? That's what he perceived. No, I stayed in my lane. The road was straight, the conditions were clear. Brenner tried a different angle. Is it possible you appeared agitated or resistant, even subtly? No, Naomi said calmly. I've been through ambushes in Kandahar. I've trained soldiers to de-escalate armed conflict. I don't react to traffic stops with agitation. Brenner stepped closer. Would you agree that in uniform people respond to you differently? I would. So if Sergeant Mallory had known your rank, you think he'd have acted differently. Naomi looked at him. He admitted that himself didn't. Brenner froze, because it was true. On record during discovery, Mallory had said, if I'd known who she was, I probably would have handled it differently. A silence fell again, the kind of silence that can't be denied or explained away. Eleanor stood. That's a powerful admission, isn't it? Naomi replied, it means he sees obedience when there's rank and threat when there isn't. It wasn't a punchline. It was the truth. When the defense rested and Naomi stepped down, the weight of her testimony remained in the room like heat after lightning. Rick Mallory never testified. He sat with his arms folded, his jaw clenched, his lawyer whispering plans for damage control. But it was too late. The room had seen. The jury had watched. The playback didn't just show a stop, it showed a decision to dismiss, to dominate, to disregard. And most people watching couldn't help but think the same thing. If that were me in the car, what would have happened? Because Naomi had rank. Naomi had restraint. Naomi had a recording. Most people don't. Most people don't walk into courtrooms with medals. Most don't have lawyers fluent in military justice. Most don't speak with perfect clarity under pressure. And yet, even with all of that, Naomi was still treated as if her life didn't command pause. That's what stayed with people. Not the video, not the uniform. The fact that she did everything right, and it still wasn't enough to stop what happened. And if doing everything right still gets you treated like a suspect, what happens to the rest of us? That was the question no one in the jury box could answer. But the verdict soon would. The verdict came 3 days later on a quiet Thursday afternoon when the sky over Charleston was a dull gray, casting a soft overcast light through the narrow courthouse windows. The courtroom wasn't as crowded as it had been during testimony, but those who remained carried the same tension in their shoulders, the same alert stillness in their eyes. Naomi Carter sat at the plaintiff's table beside Eleanor Tay, her posture as composed as ever, her uniform pressed and unshaken. She didn't fidget. She didn't tap her fingers. She waited, with dignity, with certainty, but not with joy. It was never about winning. Across from her, Rick Mallory sat stiffly, his suit wrinkled. Now his tie loosened, as if the pressure around his neck had slowly built over 3 days and finally become too much. His lawyer, Charles Brenner, whispered something under his breath as the jury filed in, but Mallory didn't respond. His eyes were on the floor, or maybe nowhere at all. The foreperson stood. A woman in her late 50s, wearing a gray cardigan and glasses that had slipped down the bridge of her nose, held the printed paper with 2 hands, as if it were heavier than it should be. In the matter of Carter versus Mallory, she began, her voice steady but quiet. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. No gasp, no celebration, just silence. The kind of silence that says everything. We find that Sergeant Rick Mallory did violate the constitutional rights of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter during an unlawful traffic stop. We award damages in the amount of $50,000 to the plaintiff for emotional distress and breach of civil protections under federal law. The judge, Honorable Judith Alvarez, nodded once and turned to her clerk to record the decision. Then she looked up, addressing the courtroom. In addition, this court will refer the case and its supporting documentation to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and recommend an external review of traffic stop procedures within the Charleston Police Department. Naomi lowered her head once, no smile, no sigh, just acknowledgement. She didn't look at Mallory. She didn't look at the jury. Her gaze fell to her hands, folded gently on the table in front of her, thumbs resting against each other in perfect stillness. Beside her, Eleanor leaned closer and whispered, "We could have asked for more. financially, punitive damages, career suspension. Naomi didn't look at her. She just said, "I wasn't here for the money." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Then what were you here for? To make it real?" Naomi replied, her voice quiet but certain. "To make it undeniable. Not a rumor, not a headline, a record." A few seats back, one of the observers, an older black man in a Navy veteran's cap, nodded slowly. He didn't know Naomi personally, but he understood her. He'd lived long enough to know that sometimes justice wasn't measured by the size of the settlement, but by the simple fact that someone had to answer for what they did. And this time, someone did. Mallory didn't speak as the verdict was read. He didn't object. But the subtle twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers clenched into fists against his thighs, the stiffness in his shoulders, all of it betrayed what he wouldn't say out loud. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like him didn't usually get called out, not by people like her. Especially not in court, especially not in uniform. But it had happened, and it was real, and now it would follow him for the rest of his career and beyond. The judge continued addressing the room. "This court does not find grounds for criminal charges at this time, but the plaintiff's complaint will remain on public record, and the recommendation for departmental review is formal and binding. Sergeant Mallory is advised to cooperate fully with the DOJ Review Board as summoned." And with that, the gavel struck once. Case closed. Outside the courthouse, a few local reporters waited near the steps, their microphones tucked under their jackets, unsure if the story was worth chasing or not. There were no protesters, no cameras from national outlets, just a quiet cluster of people trying to process what had just happened. Naomi didn't walk out the front doors. She exited through a side hallway, still accompanied by Eleanor, and paused briefly near the rear entrance before reaching for her phone. There was a message waiting from Fort Waverly HQ. "You did it. Proud of you. We're all watching." She stared at the words for a moment, then locked the screen. Eleanor stepped beside her. "You good?" Naomi nodded once. "I'm ready to go back to work. You could have pushed for more public attention. We still could if you wanted it." "I don't want attention," Naomi said, adjusting the collar of her jacket. "I want policy." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's rare. It's necessary," Naomi replied. For those watching from the outside, a $50,000 verdict might not seem like much. But for people who understood the system, who'd lived long enough to see complaint after complaint get buried under paperwork and excuses, this ruling meant something different. It meant that silence wasn't the only path left. It meant that dignity could speak for itself. It meant that someone listened and wrote it down. For many in the courtroom that day, especially those who'd been stopped, questioned, treated as less, without ever having their stories validated. This wasn't just about Naomi Carter. It was about precedent, about seeing someone stand up not with outrage, but with order, with facts, with proof. Because not every battle for justice comes with a camera crew. Sometimes it just ends with a verdict no one can ignore. Back inside, Mallory stood near the defense table, now alone. Brenner was gathering files, avoiding eye contact. A court officer approached and informed him of the DOJ's expected timeline for internal review. Mallory nodded once lips pressed thin. He walked out through the side exit, past the reporters, past the courthouse steps, into a city that now knew his name, not for his years of service, but for one night, one choice, one moment where he forgot what his badge was supposed to mean. And for Naomi, that was the point. Because justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes justice is the weight of the truth landing where it belongs. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She'd done what too many before her had been forced to avoid. She had been heard. And for everyone who had stayed silent, everyone who had let something go because they were afraid of making it worse, Naomi Carter had drawn a different line. Not with a fist, not with fury, but with facts. And the facts had stood tall. In the weeks that followed the verdict, something began to shift, not just in the precinct, not just in Charleston, but across departments watching from afar. The case of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter versus Sergeant Rick Mallory was no longer just a local story. It had reached national attention, picked up by major news outlets, and shared across social media, with headlines like "Veteran Officer Wins Civil Rights Case Against Local Cop" and "Body Cam Footage Sparks Policy Review After Traffic Stop Controversy." Nightly news anchors used words like accountability and systemic reform. Editorials called Naomi's actions a masterclass in discipline and principle. But within the Charleston Police Department, the real change was happening behind closed doors, in the briefings, the training rooms, and the conversations officers now had in hushed tones instead of locker room laughs. It began with a directive from the Department of Justice. A formal review of the department's traffic stop procedures was ordered, and an oversight committee was installed to audit all stop and search incidents from the past 24 months. Officers were retrained on de-escalation strategies with a new emphasis on implicit bias recognition and civilian rights during routine stops. Supervisors were required to ride along once a month with patrol officers and complete field evaluations based not on arrests or citations, but on restraint communication and respect. A new policy mandated that during any traffic stop, officers must immediately state the legal reason for the stop before requesting identification. Failure to do so would trigger automatic internal review. More importantly, the department quietly rolled out a civilian review panel made up of local community leaders, legal professionals, and residents. Yes, residents who would sit in on misconduct hearings as non-voting observers and publish quarterly summaries. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. And in law enforcement, change rarely moves faster than this. For the officers still on the job, attitudes shifted, not because they were all inspired, but because they knew now they were being watched. And slowly, some of them began to ask better questions. They reviewed footage differently. They started conversations they'd once rolled their eyes at. Even Officer Jamie Whitaker noticed a change in tone during roll call where jokes used to replace reflection. Now there was silence when policy memos were read. Now there was listening. But perhaps the most unexpected change came from Rick Mallory himself. After the verdict, Mallory was suspended for 6 weeks, pending the DOJ's internal review. Most expected he'd resign under pressure or quietly retire to avoid further embarrassment. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed. And more surprisingly, he started showing up to the newly mandated bias training sessions, not just to sit silently, but to participate. At first, no one took him seriously. Officers rolled their eyes when he walked in, sat in the front row, and kept his hands folded. But over time, people noticed he wasn't defensive. He didn't lash out. He listened. He took notes. He stayed behind to ask questions. When asked why he didn't offer a rehearsed PR line, he just said, "I didn't understand what I was doing until it cost me everything I thought I stood for." A month after returning from suspension, Mallory requested a meeting with Captain Abrams and the city's civilian liaison office. In that meeting, he proposed a pilot program where senior officers would pair with new recruits, not to teach tactical operations, but to discuss what not to do. "Let them learn from my failure," he said. No sugarcoating, no excuses, just the truth. His proposal was approved. Quietly and with limited exposure, the program was tested in 2 districts. Mallory led the first session. He stood in front of a room of 8 rookies, young, nervous, most of them barely out of academy. He told them about Naomi Carter. He told them what he thought that night, how wrong he had been, how power warped his view until he stopped seeing people and started seeing challenges to control. He didn't justify anything. He didn't try to sound noble. "I thought the badge gave me the final word," he said. "It doesn't. It gives me responsibility. I failed it. I failed her. I failed this city." That line stuck with the recruits. One of them, a young black woman named Officer Lana Harris, later said in an internal memo, "It was the first time I heard an officer own it without trying to protect himself. I didn't expect that from him. It made me think." The city didn't name a street after Naomi Carter. There were no parades, no grand statements. But her case became required reading in police academy ethics modules across the state. Her name was cited in internal memos from departments looking to revise how officers handle routine stops, and in a town hall meeting months later, where residents were invited to discuss community police relations, a young mother stood up and said, "My teenage son watched that courtroom footage. He saw someone who looked like him, who stayed calm, who told the truth, and who won. That matters. That's what changed. Not just policy, not just Rick Mallory, but perspective. Because when justice is done publicly, plainly, and without spectacle, it's easier to trust. It's easier to believe that maybe, just maybe, the system can bend toward fairness if enough people stop looking away." And for Mallory, the man once too proud to admit he misjudged someone, the change wasn't overnight, but it was real. In an interview with a local reporter months later, he was asked what he would say to Naomi if given the chance. He paused, looked down, then said, "I don't expect her to forgive me. But I hope she knows I listened, and I changed because of her. That's not nothing. For Naomi Carter, that answer never reached her directly. She didn't need it to, because change was never about Rick Mallory. It was about everyone watching. The classroom at Fort Waverly's Officer Development Center was silent, save for the rhythmic squeak of boots and chairs shifting slightly as a dozen new recruits sat at attention. The overhead lights cast a pale glow on the beige walls lined with military portraits, campaign flags, and framed quotes from past generals. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter, arms crossed loosely, the edge of her uniform jacket catching a soft glint from the projection screen behind her. Her expression was calm but commanding. She wasn't here to intimidate. She didn't need to. Her presence spoke louder than raised voices ever could. These recruits were young, barely past 22 in most cases. Some still bore the nervous energy of basic training, others already postured with the early swagger that often comes before wisdom. They knew who she was. Every one of them had heard about the trial, seen the news clips, maybe even watched the courtroom videos during one of their training briefings. But this wasn't about the case. Not exactly. Naomi wasn't here to relive it. She was here to make it mean something. She looked at them for a moment before speaking, letting the silence settle. Then she began. Power, she said plainly, is not armor. It's a burden. If you can't carry it with integrity, then you don't deserve to carry it at all. No one moved. No one dared. You'll leave this place with a rank on your chest and a title behind your name. People will salute you. They'll defer to you. You'll walk into rooms and others will stand. That can feel good. But don't confuse respect with authority. One is earned. The other is temporary. She stepped slowly to the side of the podium, walking closer to the first row. I'm not here to preach. I'm here to remind you what leadership looks like when no one's watching. Because that moment will come sooner than you think. It won't be in combat. It won't be in formation. It will be when someone questions your judgment, when someone challenges your tone, when someone looks you in the eye and refuses to flinch. One of the recruits shifted slightly in his seat. Naomi noticed, but kept going. A few months ago, I was stopped by a police officer. No cause, no explanation, no respect. I stayed calm. I followed orders, and I recorded every second. Not because I was afraid, because I knew that silence would protect him more than it would protect me. She paused there. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I took it to court. I let the facts speak. A young woman in the back, dark-skinned, tight-bun uniform, neat, sat up straighter. Naomi's eyes met hers for a moment, then shifted back to the room. And the facts were enough. Naomi walked back to the center of the room and let her hands rest behind her back. Too many of us think power gives us permission, that we've earned the right to speak first, act fast, shut people down. But real power, she said, emphasizing the word, is measured by your control, by what you don't say, by what you choose not to escalate. She turned toward the screen behind her and clicked to display a still image from her courtroom testimony, a freeze frame of herself on the witness stand in uniform, jaw steady, eyes forward. That image didn't go viral. There was no screaming, no conflict, no takedown, just truth. And that's what makes it powerful, because the truth didn't need a spotlight. It just needed a platform. She turned back to them, and that platform, it could be any one of you. The recruits listened now, not with formality, but with something closer to reflection. They weren't being lectured, they were being challenged. Naomi continued, I don't share this story for sympathy. I share it so you understand what it really means to lead in a system that isn't perfect. You'll face injustice. You'll see misconduct. And when you do, you'll have three choices. Ignore it, excuse it, or confront it. She let that hang for a moment. I didn't get justice because I was loud. I got it because I was patient. Because I stayed focused, because I knew that the law works best when people hold it accountable. She looked around the room, eyes sweeping slowly across each row. Every one of you will wear a uniform that carries weight. People will assume you're honest, that you're fair, that you're competent. Don't betray that expectation. Don't be the reason someone learns not to trust the system. There was a stillness in the room now that hadn't been there before. Speak up when something's wrong. Don't look away. Don't assume someone else will fix it. Because silence helps the wrong people. But courage, she said, stepping forward, courage helps everyone. Another slide appeared on the screen, a quote from her final court deposition. I wasn't angry. I just refused to accept that silence was my only option. She pointed to it once, then turned back. You don't need to be loud to be strong. You just need to stand your ground. I stood mine not as a colonel, but as a citizen. And that made all the difference. Then she stepped away from the podium and picked up her folder. The silence stretched. She didn't fill it with more words. She didn't need to. As she turned to leave, one recruit in the second row raised his hand, his voice steady but uncertain. "Ma'am." "What happened after?" With the officer, Naomi paused. She looked back over her shoulder. "He changed," she said. "Not because the court told him to, because the truth finally reached him." And with that, she left the room. Behind her, the class remained still. No applause, no chatter, just a group of young leaders quietly digesting the lesson they'd been given, not about rank or tactics or strategy, but about the one thing that would follow them long after they left Fort Waverly. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Naomi Carter became more than just a legal case. It became a defining moment that reshaped the way an entire system viewed power, dignity, and accountability. It reminded everyone both in and out of uniform that true leadership isn't about commanding fear or demanding silence. It's about standing firm in truth, holding steady in the face of injustice, and carrying authority with honor, not ego. Naomi's journey proved that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks calmly, documents everything, and lets justice do the talking. And that is the truest form of power any of us can have. The power to stay grounded, the courage to act with integrity, and the unshakable will to protect not just ourselves, but those who come after us. Her story showed that when we refuse to stay silent, we don't just defend ourselves, we pave the way for others to do the same. And now to everyone watching this story, what would you do in that moment? Would you speak up or stay quiet? Let us know in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their power or stood your ground when it mattered most? Share your story, we're listening. If this story moved, you don't forget to share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel to help us spread more stories of courage, integrity, and the kind of power that inspires real change. Thank you for watching and for standing with those who choose to lead by example.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.